He stood up from the third row for the last time, only to realize someone had been waiting for him every single Sunday. Caleb's fingers tightened around the worn brim of his hat as the church door groaned open, cold air rushing in against his face. Behind him, a voice called his name, soft, steady, unfamiliar in a way that made him stop mid-step. The floor creaked. He didn't turn right away. Then he heard it again, closer this time. Would you have turned around? Stay with me for this story. The church in Dry Creek had a door that never quite closed right. It always gave a low, tired creak when pushed, like it remembered every winter it had ever endured. Caleb Turner stepped through that narrow opening just after the last bell faded across the hills. He didn't rush. He never did. Dust clung to his boots, pale from the road that cut past the cattle pens and down toward the creek. He paused just inside the threshold, took off his hat without looking up, and held it against his chest for a second longer than most men did. Then he moved. Third row from the back. Left side. Same as always. The wooden floor gave a soft groan under his weight, but not enough to turn heads. Folks in Dry Creek knew him well enough not to stare. They let him pass like weather, noticed, but not spoken about. He slid into the pew, set his hat beside him, and rested his hands on his knees. His shoulders stayed squared, his back straight, like a man waiting on something that never quite arrived. From the front corner, where the organ sat tucked against the wall, Naomi Hayes saw him come in. She always did. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, not yet moving. Around her, the room filled with the quiet sounds of Sunday, coats shifting, throats clearing, boots scraping wood. But her attention stayed on the man who had already settled into his place before anyone else seemed to notice he'd arrived. 2 years. That was how long he had been coming. 2 years of the same walk, the same seat, the same stillness. Naomi had learned him the way a person learns a piece of music, one small note at a time. He took off his hat before he even cleared the aisle, 10 steps earlier than most men remembered to. He didn't look left or right. Not once. Not even when someone shifted to make space. When the hymns began, his lips moved, barely, like he knew every word but didn't feel the need to let them leave his mouth. Naomi pressed the first chord into the organ, and the sound filled the room, steady and low. The congregation rose, voices followed, but she watched him from the corner of her eye. His voice never joined them. The collection plate came down the row not long after. She didn't turn her head, but she knew the rhythm of it, knew when it reached him. He always gave the same way. A nickel. Then something smaller. Not careless. Not for show, just deliberate. As if the second coin meant something no one else needed to understand. Naomi's hands moved across the keys, the melody lifting into the rafters. Sunlight slipped through the narrow windows and caught in the dust, turning the air soft and golden. Outside, the wind brushed along the siding, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant cattle. Inside, everything felt held in place. Except him. He sat there like a man visiting a memory instead of a service. The sermon passed the way sermons did. Words about patience, about faith, about the long road between one season and the next. Naomi listened, but not closely. She had heard variations of the same message since she first came to Dry Creek. She knew what patience sounded like. She had lived it. When the final hymn came, she played it slower than usual. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough to stretch the moment. To give the room a breath longer before it broke apart. Caleb's lips moved again. Still no sound. Then the last note faded. The room shifted. Benches creaked. Folks reached for hats, coats, each other. The quiet filled with voices again, low and easy. Caleb stood before most had even turned. He picked up his hat, set it back on his head, didn't wait for anyone to mushroom out of his way, just stepped into the aisle and walked, steady and unhurried, toward the door. Naomi watched him go. She always did. He never stayed. Not for coffee, not for talk, not even for the small clusters of men who lingered outside to speak of weather and cattle prices. He left like the place had nothing left to offer him, or like he had already taken what he came for. The door creaked again as it opened. Light spilled in. Then he was gone. Naomi let her hands fall still on the keys. Around her, the room emptied piece by piece. She didn't move right away. Instead, she looked at the third row from the back, left side, empty again. Her eyes traced the worn edge of the pew where his hand had rested, the faint mark left by years of use, the small, quiet evidence of someone who kept showing up without ever really arriving. She had watched him long enough to know this much. He wasn't coming for the sermon. He wasn't coming for the people. And he wasn't coming for peace. Tansel. Naomi reached for the folded sheet music beside her, but her gaze drifted back to the empty seat one more time. A man didn't sit in the same place for 2 years straight unless something held him there. Not habit, not routine. Something heavier than that. Something he hadn't let go of. She gathered her things, stood, and stepped down from the bench. As she passed the aisle, she slowed, just a fraction, and glanced at the place where he had sat. Then she kept walking. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying dust across the road. Somewhere down that road, Caleb Turner was already heading back to his ranch, and next Sunday, he would come back. Sit in the same place, leave the same way, like a man keeping time with something only he could hear. Naomi pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the light. For a moment, she stood there, looking at the road he had taken. Then she turned back toward the church, because one thing had become clear to her in all the quiet watching she had done. He wasn't coming here to pray. He was coming to remember. And somehow, without ever speaking to him, she had been waiting too. Winter came down hard that year. It started with a wind that didn't stop. Then the snow followed, fine at first, then thick enough to swallow fence posts and blur the road out past Miller's Creek. By the second Sunday, the tracks leading into Dry Creek had nearly vanished. Inside the church, coats stayed on. Men kept their gloves tucked into their belts. Women pulled shawls tighter around their necks. Even the stove near the front worked harder than usual, the iron sides ticking as it pushed heat into the cold air. Caleb came anyway. Same door, same pause, same third row. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat, melting slow as he sat. He didn't brush it off, just let it fade into the wool. Naomi saw that. She noticed how he didn't hurry, even in the cold, didn't stamp his boots like the others, just moved through it like weather didn't get a say in how he carried himself. The service felt shorter that morning. Or maybe people were just thinking about getting home before the road turned worse. When it ended, folks didn't rise right away. Reverend Elias Boone stepped forward, hands clasped, voice steady. "We're going to keep things simple these next few weeks," he said. "Too many folks riding far, too much risk in heading back and forth. So after the morning service, we'll share a meal here. Wait out the worst of it. Head home before dark." There were nods, a few low voices agreeing. No one argued. It made sense. But Caleb stayed seated longer than usual. Naomi watched him from the organ bench as the room shifted into motion. Tables dragged across the floor. Someone laughed near the door. A pot lid clattered somewhere behind the curtain that led to the small kitchen. Caleb stood at last. For a moment, it looked like he might still leave. His hand went to his hat. His eyes moved, quick, almost uncertain, toward the door. Then he stopped. People were already lining the aisle, plates being handed out. No clear way through without brushing past someone. He stayed. That alone was enough to draw Naomi's attention a little sharper. Reverend Boone noticed too. He crossed the room, easy as ever, and placed a hand lightly on Caleb's shoulder. Said something low. Caleb nodded once, not quite meeting his eyes. A plate was pressed into his hand. Naomi stepped down from the organ, wiping her fingers against a cloth, and moved toward the tables. Lucy trailed behind her, boots a size too big, laces dragging in the dust. "Miss Hayes?" Lucy whispered, tugging her sleeve. "Do we have to sit with everybody?" Naomi glanced down, a small smile touching her mouth. "Just long enough to be polite." Lucy nodded, satisfied. They found a place along one of the benches. Not the center. Not the edge either. Just a space that didn't draw attention. Naomi set her plate down. Then she felt it. A shift in the space beside her. She looked up. Caleb stood there, plate in hand, shoulders stiff like he'd been placed somewhere he didn't belong. Reverend Boone had already moved on. There was nowhere else to sit. Naomi gave a small nod toward the empty space beside her. Not a gesture anyone else would notice. Just enough. Caleb hesitated. Then he sat. Not too close, not too far. Lucy looked from one to the other, eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that didn't bother hiding. "That's Mr. Turner," she said, as if announcing something important. "He fixes horses better than anyone in Dry Creek." Caleb's hand paused on the edge of his plate. Naomi didn't look at him right away. "I've heard that," she said, her voice even. Lucy leaned in a little. "My pa says he can calm a horse just by standing near it." Caleb cleared his throat. The sound was rough, like it hadn't been used much. "Horses just need patience," he said. The words came slow, careful. Same as most things. Naomi turned her head then. Not fully, just enough to meet his eyes for a second. "They usually do," she said. That was it. No rush to fill the silence. No questions that reached too far. Around them, the room filled with voices, plates scraped, coffee poured from a dented tin pot into mismatched cups. The smell of beans and bread settled into the wood. Caleb ate without hurry. Naomi noticed that too. He didn't watch the door. Didn't keep his body angled to leave. He stayed where he was, steady, like he had made a decision without quite knowing when. Lucy kicked her feet under the bench. "Miss Hayes plays the organ," she said, louder than needed. "She knows all the songs." Caleb gave a small nod. "I can tell." Naomi's fingers brushed the rim of her cup. "You sing them," she said. He looked at her, a flicker of something crossing his face. "Not out loud." "I noticed." That earned the smallest change in him. Not quite a smile, but something close. The kind that passed quickly, like light through moving clouds. They ate in pieces of quiet between the noise. When Caleb finished, he didn't stand right away. That was new. Naomi set her cup down, hands resting still for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls again, a low, steady sound. When he finally rose, it was without the usual urgency. He picked up his hat, paused, then gave a brief nod in her direction. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Turner." He turned toward the door, but slower this time, not quite leaving the way he used to. Naomi watched him go, and when the door creaked open, letting in a breath of cold air, she noticed something she hadn't before. He looked back, just once, only for a second. Then he stepped out into the snow. Lucy leaned against Naomi's arm. "He's not as quiet as people say," she whispered. Naomi didn't answer. She was still looking at the door, at the place where he had paused, because for the first time in 2 years, he hadn't left right away, and that felt like the start of something neither of them had named yet. The snow stayed for weeks. It packed the road hard enough that wagon wheels left clean tracks instead of sinking, and the wind carved thin lines along the drifts like it had a mind of its own. Dry Creek moved slower in winter. People talked more inside than out. Fires burned longer. Doors stayed closed. But Sundays changed. Not all at once. Just enough to notice if you were looking. Caleb still came early. Still took the third row. Still kept his hands on his knees and his voice to himself. But when the last hymn faded, he didn't stand right away anymore. He waited. Sometimes just long enough to let the aisle clear. Sometimes longer. Naomi didn't look at him when she finished playing. She gathered her sheets, folded them neat, and stepped down the same way she always did. But she knew, without turning, that he was still there. Waiting on nothing in particular, or maybe something he hadn't named yet. They sat together again the next Sunday, and the one after. Not by accident. Reverend Boone didn't have to guide him this time. Caleb found the place on his own. Same bench. Same space beside Naomi. Lucy smiled like she had been expecting it. The conversations didn't grow much. Not in words, but they changed. Caleb started asking small things. "How far is the school from your place?" Naomi answered just as small. "Far enough in the snow." He nodded, like that told him what he needed. Another Sunday, she asked, "The creek holding up your fences?" "Mostly," he said, "except where the current cuts sharper." She didn't press, just let it settle between them. It was enough. Outside of Sunday, the town noticed. They always did. It started with a glance or two, then a quiet word at the general store. By the time the third week passed, folks had begun to place them together in their minds. Nothing loud, just the kind of noticing that stayed behind smiles. Then Victor Langley rode in. He came on a tall bay horse with a polished saddle and a coat that hadn't seen half the wear most men carried through a Montana winter. He moved easy, like the road had been made for him, like nothing in Dry Creek could surprise him. He introduced himself before anyone asked. Bought supplies at Abernathy's store, paid in clean bills, spoke to men like equals, to women like he had time. By the next Sunday, he was at church. Naomi saw him before the service began. He stood near the door, talking with Reverend Boone, his voice low but steady, his smile quick. When the bell rang, he took a seat near the front, not far from the organ, not far from her. Caleb came in a moment later. Same door, same pause, same third row. But when Naomi looked up, something shifted. Not in him, in the room. Victor turned once during the hymn, just enough to take in the people behind him. His gaze passed over Caleb without stopping. Then it moved forward again. Nothing in it. Nothing to hold on to. Still, it stayed with Caleb longer than it should have. The meal after service felt different that day. Warmer, louder, crowded with talk. Victor moved easily between tables, helped carry a pot from the back, laughed when someone joked about the cold. When he reached Naomi's side, he didn't hesitate. "Miss Hayes," he said, as if he had known her longer than a morning, "Reverend Boone tells me you keep the music alive in this place." Naomi wiped her hands on a cloth. "I try to keep up with it." "I'd say you do more than that." It wasn't said too smooth, just enough to land. Caleb stood across the room, a plate in his hand. He hadn't sat yet. He watched. Not long, not openly, just enough to see Victor lean closer than needed. Enough to see Naomi hold her ground without stepping back. Then Lucy tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Turner," she said, "you're standing in the way." He shifted aside. "Sorry." He found his place at the table a moment later, but it wasn't the same. Victor joined them before he could settle, took the open space across from Naomi. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. No one said no. The conversation moved around him like it had always been there. He asked questions, easy ones, about the town, the school, the road conditions. Naomi answered when it came to her, brief, polite. Caleb stayed quiet. He ate slower that day, not because he wanted to, because he didn't know when to leave. When the meal ended, Victor stood and offered Naomi his coat. "It's colder near the road," he said. "I'm heading that way myself." Naomi hesitated, just for a second. Then she nodded. "Thank you." Caleb watched them step outside together. The door closed behind them with a soft thud. For a moment, the room felt smaller. Lucy climbed onto the bench beside him. "He talks a lot," she said. Caleb didn't answer. He set his fork down, wiped his hands on his napkin, looked at the door, then away. Later that afternoon, near the schoolhouse, the wind came up without warning. Papers lifted off Naomi's arms and scattered across the snow. She turned, reaching, her gloves too stiff to catch them all. Victor moved first. He caught one sheet, then another, his coat flaring with the motion. Caleb was already halfway across the yard when he saw it. He stopped, just long enough to know he was too late. Victor handed the papers back, one by one. Naomi thanked him. Caleb stood where he was. The wind settled. The moment passed. He didn't step forward, didn't call out, just turned and walked back toward the road. That night, the ranch was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't belong to the land, but to a man who had gotten used to it and never questioned why. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, boots still on. The stove burned low. He reached for the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Opened it. Inside, everything was folded the way he had left it. A dress, a scarf, a small book with a pressed flower tucked between the pages. He didn't move them, just rested his hand there. The room held its breath. Outside, the wind shifted again, and for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like something he chose. It felt like something closing in. And somewhere in that space, without saying it out loud, he knew. He had waited too long to notice what was already slipping out of his reach. Morning came slow over the hills. The frost held onto the fence rails, thin and white, catching the first light like glass. Caleb was already out before the sun cleared the ridge. He moved through the barn without speaking, the sound of leather and iron steady in the quiet. A loose hinge on the gate. He fixed it. A warped board along the outer fence. He replaced it. Work he could measure. Work that stayed where he put it. It was easier than standing still. By midweek, word had spread. Victor Langley had been seen more than once walking Naomi home. Not close, not improper, just steady, present in a way that left no room for guessing. Caleb heard it at Abernathy's store without anyone saying his name. "She won't be alone long," one man said, folding a receipt into his pocket. "Langley's got a way about him," another answered. Caleb kept his eyes on the counter, paid for his oats, left without speaking. That afternoon, he rode past the schoolhouse. Didn't stop, but he saw the roof, one corner sagging just enough to catch snow and hold it longer than it should. He came back after dusk. No lantern at first. Just the last stretch of light, and his hands finding the ladder by memory. He climbed slow, boots finding each rung, and set to work. Hammer low, nails measured, no noise that would carry. By the time the stars came out, The line of the roof sat clean again. Snow would slide off it now, instead of settling in. He didn't wait to see it in daylight. Just climbed down, gathered his tools, and left. The next morning, Naomi noticed. She stood outside the schoolhouse with Lucy and two other children, watching them argue over a stick that had become something else in their hands. Her eyes lifted to the roof. The edge was straight. She hadn't fixed it. No one had said anything. Her gaze drifted to the road. Empty. Lucy tugged her sleeve. "Miss Hayes?" Naomi looked down. "Yes?" "The roof ain't leaking anymore." "No," Naomi said softly. "It isn't." She didn't ask who had done it. Some things didn't need asking. Days passed like that. Small changes. A loose plank on the bridge over Miller's Creek replaced. The one that always dipped under her weight, just enough to make her step quick. Now it held steady. A nail hammered back into the rail near the path she took home. Nothing said. Nothing claimed. But the work spoke. Caleb never mentioned it. Not on Sunday. Not anywhere. He sat in the same place, ate at the same table, answered when spoken to. Nothing more. Victor was there again. Closer now. He carried wood from the back without being asked. Set it near the stove. Spoke with Reverend Boone like he had plans that reached beyond a season. When he sat near Naomi, he leaned in just enough to close the distance. Not pressing. Just certain. "Road's clearing north," he said one Sunday, brushing snow from his sleeve. "I've got a place up past the ridge. Good land. Could use a school out that way." Naomi folded her napkin. "That's a long ride for children." "They'd come," he said, "if there's reason." His eyes held on her a moment longer than needed. Caleb watched from the far end of the table. Didn't interrupt. Didn't move. But his hand tightened once around the edge of his cup. That night, he didn't sit by the stove. He stood. Moved through the room without purpose. Then stopped at the chest again. Opened it. The same things lay inside. Untouched. He picked up the small book this time. Turned it once in his hand. Set it back. Closed the lid. The silence settled heavier than before. Sunday came again. The air held a hint of thaw, just enough to soften the edges of the snow. Caleb sat in the third row. But when the service ended, he didn't wait for the aisle to clear. He stood. Walked forward. Not fast. Not slow. Just certain. Naomi was near the back table, stacking plates. Lucy had already run outside with the others, boots thudding across the wooden floor. Victor stood a few feet away, speaking with Reverend Boone. Caleb stopped in front of her. For a second, neither of them spoke. Up close, the space felt different, closer than it had ever been. "Miss Hayes," he said, her hands stilled on the plate she was holding. "Mr. Turner." He shifted his hat once in his hands, looked at the floor, then back at her. "I was hoping we might step outside a minute." She studied his face, not long, just enough. Then she nodded. "All right." They walked out into the cold. The air bit sharper than it had inside, the kind that made breath visible, even when it was steady. He led her around the side of the church, where the wind didn't reach as hard. The old oak tree stood there, branches bare, stretching up into a pale sky. He stopped. Turned to face her. For a moment, nothing came. His fingers worked the brim of his hat. "I ain't much for talk," he said at last. "You probably noticed." Naomi's expression didn't change. "I have." He let out a breath that almost carried a smile. I take my time with things, he went on. Maybe too much. The wind moved through the branches above them. I seen you with Langley, he said. Not sharp, just stated. Naomi didn't look away. You have. He seems like a man who knows what he's about. That's what people say. Caleb nodded once. I ain't him. No, she said. You're not. The words settled between them. Different. He reached into his coat then, slow, like he didn't want to startle the moment. Pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, held it out. I noticed your sleeve, he said. Back near the school. Thought you might need something warmer. Naomi took it. Her fingers brushed his, just for a second. Cold against cold. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside, a pair of wool cuffs, dark gray, thick and even. The stitching wasn't perfect, but it held strong, meant to last. She looked up at him. Something in her eyes shifted. Caleb straightened, like the weight of what came next had settled in his chest. I don't know how to say things the right way, he said, but I know what I mean. He paused, then pushed forward anyway. I don't want to just sit behind you on Sundays anymore. The words hung there, simple, unpolished, true. I'd like to come by, proper, sit with you, not just here. Naomi held the cuffs in her hands, didn't answer right away. The wind moved again, softer this time, and for the first time since he had started speaking, Caleb waited, not to leave, but to hear. Naomi didn't answer right away. She turned the wool cuffs over in her hands, her fingers tracing the uneven lines where the thread tightened and loosened. They weren't perfect. That was the first thing anyone would notice. But they were steady, made by someone who didn't rush. The wind moved through the branches above them again, softer now, like it had settled in to listen. Caleb stood still. He didn't fill the silence, didn't try to explain what he had already said. His hands rested at his sides, hat held low, like he was giving her the space he had never known how to ask for. Naomi lifted her eyes, held his. There was something different in the way she looked at him now. Not new, not sudden. Just clearer. Like something that had been there all along had finally stepped forward into the light. You always sit in the same place, Tata, she said quietly. Caleb nodded once. I do. Third row, left side. That's right. She tilted her head just slightly. And you always leave before anyone can stop you. He didn't answer that. Didn't need to. Naomi's fingers closed around the cuffs. I used to wonder why, she said. Thought maybe you just didn't like people. A faint shift crossed his face. Not quite denial, not quite agreement. She went on. Then I realized, you weren't avoiding folks. She paused. You were holding on to something. The words didn't land heavy. They settled. Caleb let out a slow breath. The kind a man doesn't realize he's been carrying until it's gone. I was, he said. Naomi nodded, like she had expected that. Her gaze dropped to the wool in her hands again, then back to him. I wasn't waiting for Sundays, she said. Caleb's brow tightened, just a fraction. Naomi took one step closer. Not much, just enough to close the space he had left open. I was waiting for you to stay. The words came soft, but they didn't leave room for doubt. Caleb didn't move. For a second, it looked like he might not understand. Then it settled in, slow, deep, like everything else about him. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. The town moved on behind them, Voices drifting from the church, a door opening, someone calling out to a child. But out here, beside the old oak, it stayed quiet. Caleb nodded once, not to agree, just to mark that he had heard her. "I can do that," he said. No promise beyond it, no flourish, just the truth of it. Naomi's mouth curved, small and real. "That's all I was asking." They stood there a moment longer, not because they didn't know what came next, but because neither of them rushed what had taken so long to reach. The weeks that followed didn't change all at once. Caleb still came early, still took his hat off at the door, but he didn't sit in the third row anymore. The first time he paused at the aisle, looked at the place he had always gone, then kept walking. Naomi didn't turn when he sat beside her, but her hand rested a little closer to the edge of the bench. After the service, he stayed, not just for the meal, for the talking. Small things at first: weather, fences, the way the creek would run come spring. Lucy noticed first. "Mr. Turner talks more now," she said one afternoon, swinging her legs under the schoolhouse steps. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. Victor Langley stopped coming not long after. No trouble, no scene. Just a quiet nod one Sunday, a brief word with Caleb outside the church. "You're a fortunate man," he said, easy as ever. "Don't waste it." Caleb didn't argue, didn't explain, just nodded back. Spring came slow, but it came. The snow pulled back into the hills, the road softened. Grass found its way through the dirt in thin, stubborn lines. The day they married was clear. No wind, just sunlight settling across the church like it had always belonged there. Naomi didn't play the organ that morning. Someone else took her place. She stood at the front instead. Caleb didn't sit in the third row, didn't stand at the back. He stood beside her, where he belonged. Years passed the way they tend to in a place like Dry Creek. Not fast, but steady. One evening, long after the last frost had given way to summer, Caleb sat on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands. The boards were smooth now. The rail held firm. The gate didn't creak unless the wind pushed it. Naomi stepped out beside him, a cup of coffee in each hand. She handed one over without a word. Below them, 2 children ran across the yard. A boy with careful steps. A girl who laughed louder than she needed to. Caleb watched them, then leaned back in his chair. Naomi sat beside him. Close, not by accident. They didn't speak for a while. Didn't need to. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in colors that never stayed long enough. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from the church. Faint, familiar. Caleb's eyes drifted that way, not with the weight they used to carry, just a glance. The third row still sat where it always had, left side, empty. And it would stay that way, because the man who once sat there, holding on to something he couldn't let go, had finally learned how to stay. Right where he was, and if you think about it for a moment, you can almost feel what that must have taken. To sit in the same place week after week, holding on to something that no longer lives in the present. To tell yourself that leaving early is easier than risking one more loss. And then one day, to realize that maybe the real risk isn't loving again. Maybe it's never trying. What would you do, standing where Caleb once stood? Would you keep walking out that door? Or would you stay? Because sometimes, love doesn't arrive like a storm. It waits. Quietly, patiently, in small glances, in shared silence, in the space someone leaves open beside them. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't ask for grand promises, just the courage to remain, That's what this story leaves behind. Not a miracle. Not a perfect ending. Just a man who chose to stay. And a woman who never stopped waiting long enough to be seen. If this story found something in you, something familiar, something quiet, tell me where you're watching from. I'd really like to know. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, the kind that linger a little after they end, there's a seat here for you anytime you come back.